Hello, everyone. Welcome to week 4 of Rewriting Skyscraper History. We're delighted to have you join us tonight for 2 talks that I think quite a number of people have seen already, but we may need to summarize a little bit. And we have tonight for us 2 Andrews, which is going to make everything extremely confusing when we try to talk one at a time over this platform. But Andrew Dolkart, whom many of the New Yorkers know and really needs no introduction, although when I do the introductions with the slides, you'll see a couple of book covers by each of our speakers, and therefore I will use that as the cue for the introduction. And then another Andrew, who on his books has A.K. Sandoval-Strausz, quite a long Scrabble word to get a lot of consonants, high performing consonants in there. And so I'm going to call him, I think I'm going to call him Andrew, or maybe AK. But anyway, we'll try to keep our Andrews straight for the night. But we have a richness of everything Andrew. If you have had time to to listen to the video of the subjects of not the office, but not the tall office building, but other kinds of tall buildings in especially the late 19th century and into the early 20th century, you got with both Andrews a kind of quick, condensed, but incredibly rich survey of a particular typology of high-rise buildings that hasn't had a tremendous amount of attention. Since I think about a total of maybe 50 or so of the more than 160 or 80 that are on our RSVP list for this evening had a chance to watch the videos before, and we apologize because not all of the videos were up in quite enough time in order to be able to absorb them over the weekend. So we'll do a little bit of summarizing of the ideas, the kind of thesis of each of the short presentations, so that we can then get into a dialogue back and forth with the 2 Andrews. And normally in a physical world where we would be meeting here, we'd be having a kind of symposium with half-hour talks, and then maybe perhaps discussants and a question and answer period after. But here the discussants are each other speakers, and we have the luxury of having had the talks before, so there's an abundance of time in order to solicit your questions from home in the chat box of GoToWebinar, and to send you for you to send us your questions later if that serves. So what I'm going to do right now is do a kind of quick overview of this idea of typology and the early tall building in its principal uses as we explored them in an exhibition called 10 and Taller. And I'm going to share my screen now and go to my PowerPoint as we speak. Oops. So, Rewriting Skyscraper History, Looking Back from the 21st Century is the title of this series, which is an overview of a number of different themes that help us to find a way into the issue of the skyscraper. We've looked at materials, we've looked at structural approaches, we've looked at cultural influences, we've looked at corporate architecture versus commercial, and the kind of sly allusion to Louis Sullivan and his tall building, the tall office building artistically considered, is the tall not office buildings and other uses and other issues that we took as our topic for tonight. Now, this is a screenshot of the page from our website where if you scroll down further, you can see the 2 videos by the 2 Andrews. And you see their bios, which you can also read, and I won't talk about them in order to save time. And you can see also a link to the Louis Sullivan famous essay of 1896 about the tall building on this site as well, because we want to encourage readings by by everyone, in order to make a kind of skyscraper syllabus that goes along with this course. So just two quick book covers by way of introducing Andrew A.K.'s work on the hotel, the book that resulted from his dissertation, The Hotel in American History. Andrew is a professor at now Penn State University, and previously had taught for a number of years at Arizona State University. And during that time, he produced the hotel book, which I highly recommend to everyone, that does a sweeping history from colonial times up to pretty much the present day, and as you saw in his talk, of motels, of the kind of material, cultural history of hotel and the urban history of the hotel. So Andrew is an urban historian by training, not an architectural historian like Andrew Dolkart and I are. And you see his other recent book, Barrio America, How Latino Immigrants Saved the American City, which is a talk that he gave back last February, one of our last in the pre-COVID era. And a wonderful lecture that you can see in a video on our website. And so I recommend that to you to talk about it, to listen to at a later time, but also to underscore that another one of his specialties, and at Penn State, he directs the Latinx studies there at the university, and that is also one of his specialties. Now, all of you who know Andrew Dolkart know that he has many, many books, and I just selected two that happen to fit well inside of the frame here, and that have something to do with neighborhood history, with housing, with the biography of the tenement. So we'll pass by those, and I'll give a very quick overview of how I got particularly interested in lofts and hotels and their urban history in New York. Now, as you see in the map on the screen here with the dots on it in different colors, this is a land map of Manhattan on which the Skyscraper Museum placed the footprints of 252 buildings that were built between 1874 and 1900 that constituted every building in New York that was 10 stories or taller. On this map, you see in the red dots, and you see in the key down in the lower right-hand corner, the office buildings in New York. In blue, you see two colors of blue, darker and lighter. You see residential architecture, which comprises both hotels and apartment buildings. And then you see a yellow color, a yellow-orange color, and those are loft buildings. And that was the subject of Andrew Dolkart's talk. You see them in a zoom in to this map, where you see the preponderance of oranges and reds line like metal filings on a bar magnet, attracted to the value corridor of New York, which was Broadway. Last quarter of the 19th century, Broadway attracted all of this development. And Andrew Dolkart focused on that in his 30-minute talk in particular. So what you see if we go back to the larger map is that the earliest developments, and on our website you can explore this map, it's interactive. There's a bar that you can move back and forth in order to add the building footprints by year. And you can see by adding them by year that with my cursor here, that everything up in this northern section of the city is blue, two colors of blue, which means they were all hotels or they were all apartment towers. And you'll see that in lower Manhattan, not surprisingly, they're all office buildings. But Broadway in the zoom, you can see is mostly orange. It's mostly lofts, and all of these buildings were built between 1895 and 1900. And you see all of these buildings represented on a timeline, so by years, with on a bar graph that shows the height of the building. And you can see within an individual year how many of the buildings were office buildings, as well as how tall they are, how many of the buildings were lofts, and the proportion of hotels. And you see by the last years of the 19th century that there's an almost equal number of loft buildings as office buildings. And there's a great boom in hotel construction around 1900. The data for this study came out of the research and the Excel sheet of Donald Friedman, who has contributed mightily to this program already. I hope some of you listened to his talk on structural systems and the transition from masonry to metal that forms, well, a large part of the research that underlies his new book, which is just coming out, called Structure of Skyscrapers, from the 1870s to 1900, focusing not just on New York, but in a nationwide survey. But if you take all of the buildings, and Don did find all of the buildings by going through every record in the Department of Buildings, every engineering news record, every source in individual cities for the buildings that were notable at the time because they were 10 stories or taller than 10 stories. So Don captured every single building, not just in New York, but across the country. But here you see New York. And this was an enormous contribution to our understanding of the built environment of New York, of the commercial architecture of New York, because so much of architectural historians' focus has been on the office building, the tall office building artistically considered, as Louis Sullivan directed our attention. But yet, when we look at the later years, towards the turn of the century, you see all of these unstudied buildings. Andrew Sandoval-Strausz has studied the hotel, but not just specifically in New York. And of course, many people have looked at the history of hotels in New York, but to look at the hotel as a building type offers us a different way of thinking about its history, as Andrew's book shows us. And I hope tonight will inform some of our discussion and dialogue about the idea of commercial architecture. How are lofts and office buildings and hotels and apartments similar to each other because they're all commercial architecture? That show, 10 and Taller, was installed in our gallery about 2 years ago, just to show you how, if you go to our website, you can see all the buildings together and filter them by year and by accident or demolished. We lined up all of the buildings here, a sampling of the hotels, and there's another sampling of the lofts. So that we could visualize them all. And this was all based, again, hats off to Don Friedman, who did this study that collected and combed the data. And in his new book, you can see the data page for each one of these towers. And as you can see here in two kind of Xerox samples, it gives you an enormous amount of information, not just the height, the structural system, the cost per square foot of construction. It's a very, very rich resource. And Andrew Dolkart has already showed us a number of these different hotel forms, loft forms, and then also the hotel forms like the Waldorf, the Netherlands and Savoy, or the very economical Mills building, two Mills buildings that were working men's hotels. Didn't under our discussion here, but it is documented on our website. So that is, and now I'm going to unshare my screen and we'll go back to our talking heads. then ask, let's say, which Andrew should I start with? Let's start with Lofts, since it was the first of our evening. So that, Andrew Scott, can you speculate a little bit on this speculative form of architecture and tell us why academics haven't spent much time in studying them?
Well, this is the loft is the quintessential speculative building. It is every single inch was designed to pay, and the builders built to the absolute maximum that they could here. And I think that in part they've been ignored because many of the vernacular building types that make up the everyday streetscapes of the city get ignored as people are looking to the special buildings. But also, I think that these were commercial buildings that were that the primary users were working class laborers, and so they haven't they've become part of the cultural history of New York. As you know, I'm working on a book on the architecture of the garment industry, and if you talk to any native New Yorker, they inevitably have some ancestor who was somehow involved in the garment trade. If they were sewing machine operators, or they were in the textile business, or something. And so people can tell you about the cultural history of the place. They can tell you about the labor unions, and maybe they can tell you about mafia infiltration. But if you ask them, well, where did this take place? They draw a blank. What kinds of buildings this took place in, because they're not special buildings, they're everyday buildings. And I think that that's why those are the reasons why these have been so overlooked over time. There's almost nothing at all that's been written about this first wave of skyscraper lofts, with the exception of some of the literature in the 1890s.
And you quoted at length that incredible article by McFarland and McClures, which painted the picture of entering the space, the sounds and the smells and everything else about it. You want to talk about when you discovered that?
Well, that was one of those like eureka moments that the historian sometimes has. I had been researching these buildings, and I had come to the realization that these buildings were not built to be factories, that they had been built, that a loft was meant to be a showroom building. And so that each floor maybe employed 6, 10, 12 people on any given day. But that but for various reasons that I talk about a little bit in my talk, factories suddenly moved into them. And so I came to realize that, but I didn't have the smoking gun for it. And then I found this McClure's article that was just brilliant. That it makes the point so clear that legally, according to the Department of Building, there were no factory lofts. Yet all of these buildings were used as factories. And it wasn't until after the Triangle Waste Company fire that the city finally had to publicly understand that all of these buildings that had that were built to the standards of showroom loft buildings were actually factories employing hundreds of people on each floor.
So, AK Andrew, what kind of parallels or symmetries do you find in the study of hotels as a kind of social history that Andrew Scott is talking about with lofts?
Well, this is also a form of architecture, of course, that is commercial, right? And that is intended in all cases as a business. I guess part of the unexpected findings that I came to were about the origins. Really, I think it had generally been thought that hotels emerged very gradually as just another kind of commercial architecture, out of the tavern, right? And that hospitality was sold in a gradually increasing sizes of buildings. And what I instead found, the sort of, again, a eureka moment, was that over the course of about 10 years, they multiplied in size by about 10 to 15 times. So that idea of sort of gradual evolution just did not work anymore. And I realized that this was a very clear architectural statement, right? And it was not simply that people were just, continually trying to make that rather in the 1790s initially, a group of overwhelmingly federalist developers, political figures, and other sort of important men began to hire architects, began to organize corporately, and began to say, okay, we have to make a statement now that we are a republic after the ratification of the Constitution. Our hospitality has to be on a much grander scale, has to be of a much higher quality. So the initial intent was not simply making money, but rather finding a way to provide hospitality in a completely different way that was a sort of a statement of, we are going to be a nation with a commercial future. This is not going to be a small, non-urban agricultural kind of a place, but we should, though it had not happened yet in the broader economy, really turn to a commercial traveling kind of basis.
That's really interesting. And since not everyone had the opportunity to see your talk, which got posted only today on the website, and we hope that they'll catch up, at their leisure with the richness of the arguments, as well as the kind of span of the material that you bring to us. One of the other topics that sort of contradicts the normal academic narrative, one that you just mentioned is a kind of different idea of understanding the origins of the hotel, but you also have written about the relationship of the apartment house and the closeness to the hotel and hospitality tradition, rather than the kind of architectural history that emphasizes the French flat and taking over kind of European examples of middle-class life.
Yeah, indeed. Essentially, the most commonly understood history of multiple dwellings and of large multiple dwellings that lead to skyscrapers, essentially, suggests that high land costs and the desire to put more and more people on a given plot of land drove, sort of from the standpoint of wanting to provide residences, drove the development. And in one wing of this story is to say that it originates with the tenement. So you have landlords who are looking to put up large numbers of working class people. They realize they can do that by building a new sort of multiple dwelling and charging high rents for very small accommodations. The other being a development of multiple dwellings that comes from really the middle and upper classes, in which they want to have a proper family home in the city, but the price of land is just or the cost of land is too high, and rents are too high for everyone to have their own row house. So there's an idea that they have to sort of find a new respectable kind of urban dwelling that is a multiple dwelling. Now, those two things unmistakably happened, but what I found as well is that you have a development of the apartment building that comes out of the hotel. And part of the story here is that people have been living in hotels since about the 1800s. So that as soon as the building form really sort of comes to fruition at the beginning of the 19th century, people, and I might add fairly socially eminent people, choose to live in them. It's very convenient to have somebody else preparing their meals. It's very convenient to have somebody else doing the housekeeping and doing the laundry and whatnot. So that hotel living has existed literally for decades before the development of apartment buildings as we know them. In addition, there are a number of both architectural plans and legal cases that suggests that early understandings of this kind of apartment building assumed, right, that many of the common functions would be together on the main floor and the lower floors, and that individual apartments, very much unlike the way they are now, but the way they were for decades, individual apartments would not have things like kitchens, right? Individual apartments would not have their own laundry facilities. this would all be done in common downstairs, which is essentially a spatial organization that comes directly out of the hotel, and it's essentially a function of providing hospitality to large numbers of people on a temporary basis.
And so, Andrew Dolkart, you are also an expert on the apartment house in New York. Do you have any comments about that thesis? And I know you know an enormous amount about residence hotels, and that's certainly one of the things we found in Tenement. It was almost impossible to separate into two different types, whether to make them light blue or dark blue in the graph, whether a building was a quote hotel or quote apartment building.
Well, it's interesting that in New York, at least, I separate this into three types: the hotel, the apartment house, and the apartment hotel. And the hotel being largely transient, although some people were certainly permanent or long-term residents in them, and apartment houses were permanent residents who had kitchens, and apartment hotels, which were permanent or semi-permanent buildings where they did not have kitchens. And eventually, and after 1916 in New York, when the zoning laws passed, this becomes really, really obvious because apartment houses had been capped in height. In 1901, the tenement house law caps the height of apartment buildings, but hotels were commercial buildings. And so especially after 1916, but really after 1900, developers who want to really make the land pay take this rule, and they build apartment hotels instead, because they were regulated as commercial buildings. And so they could occupy more of the land, they could be taller, they didn't have to have the same fireproofing as apartment houses did. And it was a scam, because basically they put in pantries, and then people went out and bought electric hot plates, and they created their own kitchen. And everybody knew it was a scam. The fire department knew it was a scam, but it wasn't until 1929 that they actually changed the law to allow high-rise apartment buildings. So when you think of all those apartment hotels in New York, the Sherry Netherland is a really good example of it. They were really apartment houses that were masquerading under the term apartment hotel.
Right. Well, I mean, I agree with that, and we have quite a lot on Tenement site that looks into that, but in the earlier period. So we had a talk on Monday about Tudor City, and as wonderful as Tudor City is, and people think of it as a place of residence, it was exactly what you described. It was
right. The tallest buildings are apartment hotels there.
Hotel description, and that's how it escaped the height cap that had existed actually even from 1885. There was a height cap for residential architecture. But what we found when we were looking at the distinction between hotels and apartment buildings in the period from the 1880s forward, and if I focused your attention on the graph in the earlier years rather than at the end of the century, you would have seen that save for the first office buildings, the Western Union building and the Tribune building in 1874, practically all of the tall buildings in New York were blue bars, not red bars, office buildings. So there was this boom of construction of cooperative apartments during the 1880s. But we found across all income levels, whether it was the Mills building for working class men for 20 cents a night and another 15 cents for dinner included in the price, with a room that was no larger than, I just reread this, 7.5 feet by 6 feet. That was the size of the room, but there were communal bathrooms that were sanitary. There were communal dining that was very affordable. There was a smoking room and a courtyard. There were all of the amenities of hotel life at an extremely affordable working class price. And that's at one end of the spectrum, and the Waldorf Astoria is at the other. But in the middle are all of these middle class housing, the hotels, as they were called, that are in the strip on 44th Street, like with the Algonquin. Algonquin wasn't one of those, but it was built later. But there are a whole series.
Sonia, that's the perfect example.
Yes, after our study, but there
Well,
are
1899 was when it was begun, I think.
Okay, well, it's not in Don's study because the building permit was didn't fall within in 1900. But there are many middle class buildings that say hotel on them, and said hotel on the building department application, and didn't really have anything to do with kitchens as post 1916 zoning law requirements, or slip around the code, averting the code, but were had these kind of shared amenities that Andrew AK is describing to us, that took away the hassle of having to cook something, that puts you in the theater district, ready to go out for dinner. But where you live and domicile for by the month, by the season, or by the year. So, Andrew AK, do you want to comment more about that? Uh-oh.
Yeah, I mean, I should also add it.
Yeah.
We're good? Yeah, I just want to also add something that I think initially was raised by Dolores Hayden in her book, Grand Domestic Revolution, but certainly I kept running across in my research on hotels, is that this kind of I guess what Andrew Dolkart would call an apartment hotel living was part of a larger sort of gender struggle about what kind of work women would be expected to do in the home. And there were a lot of essentially late 19th and early 20th century feminists who really sort of championed the apartment hotel, because they said, listen, this liberates women from the expectation that they will do the cooking. This liberates women from the expectation that they will do all the cleaning, right, all the laundry. And so this was both a sort of source of inspiration for feminists of this era, and also a fear for men. There was sort of I found in my research a whole profusion of frankly fairly lurid fictional stories written essentially by men for other men, saying, if you move into an apartment hotel, or if you move into a hotel with your wife, she will emasculate you, she will run around, and ultimately she will have an affair, right? They don't say it in quite so many words, but using the sort of equivalents of the 19th century, they were saying exactly that. So this was sort of caught up in the gender wars of the period in interesting ways.
Of course, what's really interesting about that is that it may have liberated middle and upper middle class women, but the people that were cleaning the rooms and probably doing a lot of the cooking were working class women who weren't liberated by this at all.
Were they more liberated when they became seamstresses in the shirtwaist factories, do you think?
Maybe slightly, if they got involved in the union movement. The women in the factories began to take responsibility for trying to improve the quality of their lives.
Indeed, and yet to pick up on what Andrew just said, right, that hotel employees were very highly unionized and early unionizing groups of people. In fact, the present day hotel employees, restaurant employees union has its origins in New York City in the late 19th by precisely originally hotel workers and bartenders.
Could we switch to a topic that is more directed at urban history and urban context? And I'm particularly interested, we haven't talked about the lofts that much in this session, but certainly Andrew Dolkart's talk so vividly illustrated with a historic view next to one that he took, just last week, walking Broadway with his camera. The kind of identity of Broadway as the quintessential New York street. I mean, many books have been written, many songs have been written about Broadway. But Andrew, can you talk about that identity of Broadway that develops in the 1890s through as the corridor that's defined, you know, kind of it's the canyon of lofts rather than the canyon of office buildings.
Well, I think that, you know, because Broadway basically runs up the center of the island, even when it's going at a diagonal, it's still staying in the center. And the center of the island was the more prestigious part, and the closer to the rivers you got, block by block, the prestige dropped, so that Broadway and Fifth Avenue become this sort of main street. So they attract first high quality residential, and then commerce follows. So in Lower Manhattan, you have the very prestigious office buildings on Broadway, you know, like the Woolworth building that Gail talked about, and then the theaters and other types of buildings. But of course, what is always completely skipped in that is the section of loft buildings. And there are, I pulled off my shelf, there are several books about Broadway. There are walking tour guides to Broadway and histories of Broadway. And either they completely skip the loft areas, or they pick out a few atypical non-loft buildings within the sea of lofts. And so, you know, so it's to me, it's so conspicuous how this type of building is completely ignored. In the same way that I have not found one guidebook to New York that talks about the Garment District, the 7th Avenue Garment District. These are just areas that were overlooked. They just weren't. It was assumed they weren't of interest to people.
So, Andrew Ake, as an urban historian, do you want to comment on kind of retrieving this history and how difficult it is too to find the sources in order to, you know, kind of, you know, revive it?
I'm sorry, could you clarify difficult to find the sources for which particularly?
So if both Broadway in the loft area have not been investigated much by historians or aesthetes, flaneurs walking Broadway, but simply ignored those buildings, how do we retrieve their stories? And similarly, how do we retrieve the hotel stories that aren't the postcard message that you send from the card you find in the desk, but all of the classes, all of the mix?
Exactly. I mean, one of the basic facts of architectural history is that you often, you know, have a fairly good record of the building itself, the way it's laid out, the way it's financed, the way it's designed. Not necessarily the best record of what goes on there, again, depending on the building type. I found that with respect to hotels, there are a lot of areas of the law that involve litigation and that end up telling you a great deal about what actually happens in the hotel. So, for example, I found a number of cases of prosecutions for seduction that gave me a pretty accurate sense of, okay, exactly how much power does the hotel keeper, if he thinks something fishy is going on in the rooms, to actually just, you know, use his master key and walk right in, right? I mean, normally you expect that if you're in a hotel room, you have a certain amount of privacy. I got a pretty strong sense in the same way of just how carefully the hotel staff would monitor people's behavior, right? That the presumption of many criminals or would-be criminals in hotels, but this is a great place to pull a caper because so many people are coming and going that really nobody notices that much. But if you actually have a look at some of these cases, you realize that the eyes of the housekeeping staff, the eyes of the desk clerk, the eyes of everybody. I mean, hotels are fairly heavily surveilled places. So there are all kinds of misbehaviors that might have been hushed up to preserve the reputation of the hotel, at least hushed up in the newspapers, that could not be hushed up when somebody takes a case to court. I might add that precisely this kind of approach was used very effectively by George Chauncey in his book Gay New York, where certain kinds of behaviors that that most people wanted to hide, at least for some of the period, do come up when the law becomes involved.
I think that, relating sort of to that is that what went on in the loft buildings is almost never discussed, and even less often photographed. It's very, very difficult to find photographs of the interiors of these loft floors and what was going on there until disaster struck. So it was the literature about the Triangle Fire is what makes so much of this public. Suddenly there are descriptions of what the factory was like and what the building was like and what the structure was like and why it was inadequate, even though it was one of the better built buildings. And then there are explorations of what these factories are like afterwards. And so it was disaster that led anyone to write about these otherwise anonymous buildings.
And what can either of you tell me about the commercial profitability of either of these building types as real estate ventures and then as businesses? Of course, with lofts, they exist only to create rents. Lofts are space, right? They're just floors of space, absolutely generic, can be used for any use. There may be a predominant use of garment industries in New York, where that is a predominant sector of the economy. Hotels, of course, you can separate often the operator of the hotel. You talked about Statler and how he became the kind of one source serves all, the vertically integrated company that conceives of the chain that builds the building, that hires and feeds and everything about, in the same way. I think you made the analogy to Henry Ford and maybe his River Rouge plant, for example. But whether it's was it Oscar of the Waldorf or was the hotelier who may not be the developer and the builder and the owner of the land, but the entrepreneur that gives the stage set and the experience, that sells the experience. Can you separate those two things for us? And can you, both of you, talk about the profitability as a real estate venture? What is the return on loft buildings, as we saw in the prospectus for Tudor City on Monday, a 6% return that was, if not promised, certainly suggested to be a sure thing by Fred French, who was trying to sell stock options in his real estate ventures.
I'm happy to go first on that, unless
no, go ahead.
Okay, so generally speaking, yes, precisely. Hotels, especially large ones, were so big that no individual person could usually put together that much money for a hotel, whether of 100 rooms or 1,000 rooms. So it was from the beginning, literally from the 1790s, a corporately organized undertaking, and the hotel keeper was a separately hired professional who essentially was given responsibility for making the thing pay. But his angle was not really would the note get paid, right? But rather, would he be rehired? Now, I don't have a strong sense of as a matter of percentages of what the return on a hotel was. I do have the sense that hotel keepers were in a constant struggle for regular revenue, right? Remember that especially the further back you go in history, the more seasonal travel is. So in the age of the steamboat, if rivers began to freeze or become treacherous, you had a lot less travel during the winter, right? Until the age of the steam locomotive, it was highly seasonal. So indeed, that's one of the reasons why hotel living sort of on a more permanent basis emerges, is that while the revenue that you as a hotel keeper get from transient guests, may vary dramatically from summer to winter, somebody who has taken a 1-year hotel lease, you can pretty much count on that money the entire year through. So that was a way of stabilizing the revenue stream. I think the other really relevant thing was that, broadly speaking, at I think 75 or 80% occupancy, a hotel would break even, and generally it was thought that almost all of the profitability came from the bar, right? Remember that a hotel license originates from a tavern license, and this was, from the colonial period, basically an agreement that the state or the local authority gives you, the license holder, the privilege of making a lot of money by retailing alcohol, by the glass for on-premises consumption. In response, or in return, you were expected to keep, proper accommodations for travelers and good and wholesome food for them, and to keep their goods safe while they're in your care. So initially, that license was saying, we know you don't really want to make accommodations for travelers, but you have to because that's the price. But later on, even then, there was a sense that the money that comes out of this overall arrangement is going to come from liquor sales first and foremost.
So I think one of the interesting differences between the lofts and the hotels is that in the hotels, as Andrew notes in his talk, there were all these spaces developed with lobbies and lounges and libraries, and so that which are not directly making money. They're setting the character of the hotel and attracting people. Whereas in the loft buildings, there's a tiny lobby that, as they didn't spend a lot on it. It's got marble walls and tile floors and maybe some metal work, and then other than that, every inch of space was put to economic use. And so at first, when these buildings were built, they were certainly very successful. In 1898, the Real Estate Record and Builders Guide, which was the weekly journal of the real estate industry, did a survey of all of the commercial buildings from somewhere in Lower Manhattan up to about 14th Street. And they noted that there was a substantial vacancy rate in the old loft buildings, that is the mid-19th century five-story loft buildings, and that the new skyscraper loft buildings were filled, and that a lot of people had moved out of the old buildings into the new buildings. How profitable they continued to be is still a question. The garment industry tended to move, and it tended to cluster. Like all the cloak makers wanted to be together, so that when the buyers came from out of town, they only had to visit a few buildings or visit sites within a few blocks of one another. So as the industry moves north, how these buildings got eventually filled is unclear. And certainly by the post-war period, the lower Broadway, south of 14th Street, was an incredible backwater. The buildings were not profitable, which is why, of course, NYU was able to buy many of them and convert them into classroom buildings, because there were no industrial uses, were declining. And then many of these buildings have been converted into residential buildings, and others are still used for commercial purposes. They're rental, but mostly offices, no longer for factories today. So they did pay well. They were very profitable at first, but I think that the profitability declines, but I can't tell you exactly how precipitous that decline was.
Well, Andrew Dolkart, you did say in your talk, and in case not everyone had a chance to hear it yet, that you were curious about you knew something about some individuals who had invested in the buildings that you were looking at, the Broadway buildings, and you were also curious about what the advantage was, or what the story was really about the really narrow 25-foot lots and how they got developed to 12 and 14-story buildings. Do you want to speak a little bit more about that, and speculate about the kinds of people who made these investments, and what they tell us about real estate and maybe ethnicity or other issues about making it rich in New York?
Well, I know who the builders were of these buildings, and what is very interesting to me is that the builders of this first generation of skyscraper lofts was very diverse, because the later generations, the Seventh Avenue Garment District was built up almost entirely by Eastern European Jews, many of whom had been garment factory owners and then moved into real estate. But the buildings in this first generation that cluster on Broadway, some of them were the old landowning families who had probably owned the land for many decades. The Havemeyers are an example of this, but there are other families as well. And then another group were speculative real estate developers. I point out the Jeremiah Lyons, who built commercial buildings elsewhere in the city as well. And then others were German Jewish investors, and it was the German Jews who largely ran the garment industries at that time. And so you've got a mix of different groups. What I don't know, and what I think is a really interesting question, and which I hope to be able to find out once one can go into records again, is who else invested in these besides the builders? Did they have mortgages? These buildings were cheap. They didn't spend a lot of money on these buildings, unlike the hotels where money was spent on design, especially on the interior. That was not the case with the loft buildings. So they built them in a relatively cheap manner, maybe gussying them up with a little bit of ornament on the facade. But still, I think that a lot of that there were other investors and mortgagees involved.
As we have only about 7 or 8 minutes left, let me ask you, kind of put you on the spot and ask you, what do you think are the questions for urban historians within these subjects that are broader questions about urban history? If we haven't studied these building types very much, or we haven't embedded them in the urban economy and the urban sociology, the labor story, everything, where are the most fruitful areas for a broad and synthetic urban history and architectural history that makes architectural history more rich because of its urban context? What would you suggest are to your students are fruitful areas for further research? Yeah, AK.
Okay, sure. Essentially, one of the really characteristic changes of our times is, of course, globalization. But the most apparent and I think immediate form of globalization is huge numbers of people on the move, right? So that there are currently, I think, about 3 to 4% of the population of the world lives in a country where they were not born. So all told, that's huge numbers of people moving from place to place, and depending on what you're reading in terms of studies of globalization, some people see this as sort of a major prompt for the kind of xenophobic nationalism that has emerged in the last 4 to 20 years in the United States, Europe, and now Latin America. So trying to figure out how people in the past dealt with the presence of huge numbers of people they didn't know, in some cases immigrants, in others merely migrants. One of the classic conditions of urbanity is being surrounded by people totally unknown to you. So trying to watch, as sort of in the era of the growth of cities, trying to watch people respond socially, legally, architecturally, tells you a lot about both our present moment, and I might add about the emergence of what is now the biggest sector in the American and the world economy, which is the service industry, right? These kinds of places that serve people, that provide them with things they normally would get at home, but they might be away from home if it's just for lunch. on the job, or if they're, on a business trip. That can tell you a lot about labor relations, about gender relations, about governance, about identity. So I think that might be one way to go about this.
For me, I think that the challenge is for urban historians, especially those interested in the physical fabric of cities, is an examination of what typifies an urban environment, and not to ignore those, not to just look at the major buildings, but to look at the common everyday buildings. And I think that that's a real challenge, that the everyday hotels, the everyday apartment houses, even the row house. There's been a lot written about the row house, but it's all style based. And you can just go so far with this is a Greek Revival row house. So I think that is, to me, is the biggest challenge. And for me, I'm working on a topic for which a huge amount is known from the point of view of social history. The history of the garment industry has been so well researched, and so trying to take that and give it a place base, because place is powerful, and so I think that place has been ignored in a lot of these histories, and that's what Andrew and Andrew have been trying to do, is to add place to these histories.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I would add that the other thing that you're both doing very, very beautifully, very, very richly, is looking behind the facade. So we're not just looking at the shape of the building or the ornament that defines its style, but its use, its origins in the economy, in society and culture. That certainly gives more richness to architectural history and also to urban history. So as we conclude and then look forward to the 5th week of our series, when Joanna Merwood Salisbury is going to talk about architecture, labor, and capital, or skyscrapers, labor, and capital, but again focused on the 19th century. We'll be taking, yet another slice at a topic that has, it's when I said slice, I thought it's like a salami of meaty topics that we can take a cut through each time. But I have to confess that my interest in pairing the two of you together on this topic tonight was really to try to find some fundamental definition of, if not the skyscraper, the tall building in the 19th century, as being an urban commercial architecture, whether it's an office building, whether it's a loft building that is virtually unstudied, whether it's a hotel which has had a lot of attention to individual stories of glamour or intrigue or sex scandal. We've looked at all of these things, whether it's Edith Wharton or any one of a number of these kind of scandalous social histories that transpire in the crime not novels, the crime nonfictions that populate the shelves I've seen just recently at Rizzoli. All of those titillating stories have behind the facade the seamstress, the scullery maid, the workers who live in the city, live in the tenements, populate the other buildings that are not the ones that have been the focus of the exhibition that we did and is the focus of the museum, the tall buildings, which create their own typology by being tall, being investments in capital, investments in land, businesses themselves as they are intended to produce rents, whether it's the fees for the hotel for the night or the per square foot of a loft building. So it's that subject of the commercial and urban nature of the high rise that I would like to reinsert and maybe even substitute for the structural determinism that has given us a definition of the skyscraper as a tall building with a skeleton frame, which is completely irrelevant in the 21st century when no skyscrapers in China or the rest of the world are built of steel, but instead built of concrete. So we, in asking these questions about what is most fundamentally a characteristic of the tall building across time and continuing into the 21st century, it seems to me that the urban commercial typology, no matter the use, is something that we do need to focus on. And so I thank you both for your work in focusing on this urban environment and helping us to understand these individual typologies better. So thanks, everybody. Night.
Thank you all.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Carol.